Canadian women are changing the conversation around when and how they want to have babies, with many of them opting to freeze their eggs. And more, led by Gen Z, they're having the conversation online. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. Calgary Herald reporter Devika Desai joins me to discuss why the women of Gen Z are freezing their eggs and how social media communities on apps like TikTok are helping them foster conversation and find support. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Devika, you recently took a look at the practice or the idea of younger generations, Gen Z in particular, going through the process of freezing their eggs or putting off having kids for whatever reason. Could be they're single now or they want to set up their career. And we can talk about some of those reasons in a little bit. But I guess for starters, a bit of a background on the practice. When did the practice of women freezing their eggs begin?
Yeah, so the science of egg freezing, which is kind of more formally known as like oocyte cryopreservation, it actually dates back to the 1980s. Actually, if you want to get super techie about it, cryopreservation actually kind of dates back to, I think, about the 1940s, but it didn't really come to human eggs until the 1980s, kind of just with the advancement of certain techniques. And I actually think the first live births from egg freezing actually happened in 1986. I think it was twins from Australia, so that's a really cool fact. But obviously back then, before it kind of became more commercially viable in about like the late 2000s or 2010s, it really more applied to women who had to use egg freezing sort of as an emergency measure. So really for women who were going through any sort of aggressive medical therapies, chemotherapy, for an example, and felt that or were told that they may lose their natural fertility as a result of it, they would use egg freezing as a way to preserve their fertility should they want to have kids after going through whatever therapy that they needed to do. So the practice of women using, egg freezing in a more social context as a choice to be able to have children regardless of their physical or medical health didn't really get to the mainstream, I think, until about the 2000s or the 2010s, or maybe a little bit after. I would say maybe even the last 2 decades.
And for those not familiar, how does the process work?
So from a client's perspective, from a woman's perspective, it first starts with, you're walking into the doctor's office. The first step is to determine if you're even viable for freezing your eggs, because obviously everyone's body is different, everyone's biology is different. So sometimes people just don't qualify for it, which may just be the unfortunate truth. And the way doctors determine that is by taking a series of blood tests, hormonal work, your follicle count, which really just determines how many eggs do you have, what are the quality of your eggs, and any ovarian health. And then if all of that is good to go, then you start the egg freezing process. And really what that is that the first one is stimulating egg production in your follicles. So for 14 days, you're given a series of hormone medications. And really what that is, that what that does is that just stimulates the eggs to grow in your follicles. And then at the end of those 14 days, you go through an egg retrieval process where basically experts will use an ultrasound needle to retrieve the eggs and then flash freeze them. And then they're just kind of put in these liquid nitrogen storage tanks to be frozen for however as long as you want them to be frozen.
Mm-hmm. And then later this might be a technical question, but are they used for in vitro fertilization and then implanted, or are they used for in utero? How does that work when someone decides finally, okay, I've frozen my eggs and I'm a later period of my life, but I want to have kids? How does that process work?
So it really just depends on the person. It can be used for in vitro fertilization. So if they wanted to, they could totally use it for IVF. If they feel like they have the capabilities to kind of carry the eggs themselves, then it would just kind of be implanted back in the uterus and see if pregnancy can be stimulated. It really just depends on the person whose eggs, who owns the eggs.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that kind of early on that it was done for emergency reasons. What does that mean? Is it someone was facing a disease that might impact their later fertility or a health issue or perhaps a grievous injury?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So for the longest time, egg freezing, and I think someone put that really aptly in the story that I wrote. It was really traditionally seen as a reactive procedure versus a proactive procedure, which really just means that either medically you're faced with a situation, I think the most common reason could be cancer. Potentially you have to go through some sort of aggressive chemotherapy that could negatively affect your fertility and your ability to naturally conceive. And so in that case, you might turn to egg freezing so you can try and preserve your fertility or preserve that ability to conceive once you've kind of gone through that chemotherapy. It was definitely more reactive.
Okay. And then as you mentioned that the reasons have changed, and I guess in the last 2 decades, we've seen a change to more social reasons that someone may want to freeze their eggs. What does that mean, the social reasons? Is it like lifestyle? Is it relationship status? And what's the thinking behind deciding you're going to freeze your eggs? Because is it at some point you may think, well, I'm in my 30s now and I want to have kids, and perhaps I might not be as viable as I once was.
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of it. You sort of hit the nail on the head over there. I think the way I like to describe it is that I think over the past decades, I would say it's kind of, well, okay. I mean, at the core of it, egg freezing is really just to preserve fertility and to preserve your choice to have kids in the event that natural conception is not possible. But as you said, the reasons for that has kind of changed. I like to say that it's kind of the goal of it is kind of changed from fertility preservation to fertility agency. So, at first, before it was commercially viable, it was most accessible to women who had to use it as an emergency procedure. And then, sort of in the 2000s to 2010s, once it was deemed non experimental by the American Society of Reproduction Medicine, I think that was in 2012, it sort of became more of a social procedure. So, by that, it then became more appealing to women who were, I think, mostly potentially in their 30s, maybe even 40s, who wanted to have kids. But then at that time, and this could be for a variety of reasons, as you said, maybe, career kind of took the forefront. And so they weren't really able to make room for family planning until much later in their life. Maybe they just didn't have the best success finding a partner if that was a route that they wanted to go with familyhood. Maybe they were just, they just had other priorities in their life that they wanted to lead before kind of going to family planning. And so, I think in about the 2000s to 2010s, it really was kind of women in their 30s and 40s who then saw egg freezing as sort of a last resort measure. It's kind of like, oh, I think there's a chance that I'm going to pass on the ability to naturally conceive. So I would like to consider freezing my eggs in the event that by the time I'm in a situation where I can family plan and I can have children, I have this almost like insurance measure. Insurance is a bit of a loose word, to be able to conceive and have children. But kind of in the later years, and especially in the past decade, it's been really cool to see women sort of see it as more as fertility agency. And by that, what I mean is that rather than seeing egg freezing as this reactive last resort measure, it's become more of this planning measure. So, for example, one of my sources, Shania Bopa, she's 25. She froze her eggs at 25. 25 is still fairly young. Her eggs, I health wise, of course, I'm not the expert here, are perfectly healthy and would continue to be healthy for at least another decade or so more. But she kind of did the math on her life. She talked to her own family. She did her own research and kind of realized that she is not going to be able to have that room in her life to be able to have a family until she's potentially in her mid 30s, by then, which, her ovarian health, or rather her egg health, may be affected. So she wanted to plan for that. And so so she sort of kind of took matters into her own hands and decided to freeze her eggs as a sort of an insurance, as a sort of to, sort of bypass that quote unquote biological clock. So she can sort of have it all, be able to, go for the career, live the life that she wants without the pressure of having to have kids at a certain point in her life before it becomes too late.
I do want to explore a bit more of her story in a bit, but I am curious, like, when it comes to issues of fertility, there seems to be a great deal of stigma
Yeah.
around it. If you're a couple and you're having trouble conceiving, there are feelings of shame or wondering what's wrong. And I imagine with this practice as well, that, if you've had to freeze your eggs because of a health reason, or if you had to freeze your eggs because of perhaps you're not where you want to be in your life, that there is a bit of a stigma. Is the practice becoming more socially accepted, or is there still a bit of stigma attached? And where does that come from?
I think it's kind of a combination. Anecdotally, I would definitely say that it is becoming more widely accepted. And for me, I would say the proof lies in the conversation on social media. So, part of why I even pursued this story was because last year it was actually something that I had been considering for myself. And in order to find out more, I kind of went online, I went on social media, and I was pretty heartened to see this conversation about it. It wasn't just by medical experts who were leading the conversation, it was actually just other women kind of posting videos about, hey, we kind of went through this procedure. This is what it was like. Hey, I'm thinking about going through it. Here are my concerns. Here are my anxieties. Here's what I'm thinking about it. There was this whole kind of community conversation about it, which is really heartening to see. And that wasn't really there. I could be wrong, I don't know, but at least I wasn't, it wasn't even really quite there pre-pandemic. And I think the fact that this conversation has kind of appeared on such a public platform does kind of suggest that the stigma is reducing. That being said, again, anecdotally, I haven't seen the conversation on the ground, even with among me and my own friends. We haven't actually had this conversation in person with each other. Even a couple of the women who I interviewed, or rather all the women who I interviewed in my story, they've all kind of admitted the same thing, that they don't really see the conversation happening on the ground. And in fact, all the women who I interviewed on the story took to, their own public platforms to be vocal about their stories in a way of kind of pushing that conversation forward. So, yes, I think the stigma is definitely reducing in the sense that it is becoming more widely accepted. We are kind of seeing that more online, but I think there is definitely still that way to go. And kind of, part of what you said, when it comes to people even talking about the idea of having children or fertility at its core is an intensely personal topic. There's a certain intimacy to that by the nature of it can lend a certain stigma to it. The talking about the ability to have children and all the factors that might go into that, to if you want to find a partner, to try and create family, these are all just very intensely personal topics that can just be difficult to talk about. I think there were some studies that have been done that kind of show that, especially in, well, even now, and in today's age, for some women who choose to pursue egg freezing, they might feel a certain level of stigma around it, because maybe in their minds it's, well, we haven't been able to find a partner, we haven't been able to go the what you would consider the traditional route of find a partner, create a family, and then have children. And so egg freezing has now become this sort of alternative to, well, if I can't find a partner, maybe this is the route that I want to go to. So yeah, it is becoming more widely accepted, but I think it's just a matter of continuing to kind of pull back the curtain on the conversation so it feels more commonplace than unusual.
We'll be right back. As you mentioned, that some of the people you talked to for this story were sharing their stories online, or sharing their journey online. What drove them to be so public about it? And are there any common threads between these people, either like age or career status or relationship status? Is there a sense of kind of who the face of this issue is now?
So all the three women who I interviewed for the story, they're all, prior to sharing the stories, were already kind of social media personalities to some extent. They're all to some extent fairly used to kind of, having their face on the public platform, and maybe to some extent that I don't want to obviously, speak for them, but maybe that might have lent some level of comfort to being able to kind of share their story online. In terms of other commonalities, I think the three of them, from at least my conversations with them, are really kind of united in their goals on why they wanted to kind of share their stories. And that really just comes down to three things. It's one, to share information about, what is egg freezing, what does it entail, the cost, the procedure, the emotional impact of it, to create awareness of it. The fact that this is something that's out there, it is an alternative, it is a means of creating fertility agency for yourself and how you can go about that. And three, it's also just kind of creating some community about it, not even just around egg freezing, but just around the anxiety and some, fears and hopes that I'm sure women, maybe not even women, but just people might be feeling about wanting to have children, and what all of that entails. So I don't know if you've had the chance to kind of check out, Shania, of Antoinette's profiles, but they are so specific. And even Missy's for that matter, they kind of show like a day 1, day 2, day 3. Here's what it's like to kind of even inject the hormones into ourselves. Here's what it entails. Here's the anxiety of it. I don't know how I'm doing it. Let's figure it out. And even just watching them do it, it feels so much more accessible. It feels a little bit more personal to actually see someone kind of go through the learning of it versus going to a medical expert and kind of just getting sort of the how-to listings of it. And then again, like I said, the awareness is just, you're learning more and more that this is something that's not necessarily unusual. The more you talk about it, the less stigma that's associated with it. And the community of it is that, it just kind of removes the isolation of the process. It's just nice to know that if you're going through that process, you're not the only one going through it, because here's this community of women who are talking about it online.
And as you said, you found this community looking through your own experience, and I imagine you're not alone. And lots of people are coming to these creators through their curiosity or their concern. How did people like Shania and Missy feel about the impact that they're having on others?
I think they were quite heartened to see the positive feedback that they receive from people online, from their commentators. I know when I spoke to Shania about that, despite being a public personality, she did say that talking about her egg freezing journey was actually quite a detour from the stuff that she normally talks about. Usually she's kind of mentioned that her public persona is very different to her private persona. I think previously she has kind of focused her Instagram accounts or social media accounts on her businesses, on kind of advising women on how they can sort of be the do-it-all and how you can kind of have your career and whatnot. And kind of sharing her egg freezing journey was quite a detour from that. And she was quite hesitant about what that would mean. And she was quite heartened to just kind of see the feedback from that, to see that people were kind of resonating with her journey, that people had questions about it, that people were kind of thanking her for being so open about it. I think she said that it made her feel a little bit closer with her community. Same thing with Missy Model. I think she had mentioned that a big part of why she had hesitated for so long to even get into egg freezing was because she hadn't really seen anyone be public about their own journey. And so for her to kind of have to take that step and be public about it, no doubt must have been quite scary on its own. But once again, kind of seeing that community come together, I think imagining for them, again, don't necessarily want to speak for them, but I think it sort of had a two-sided effect where they kind of felt like they were creating community, but then they also felt like they were able to be a part of a community while they were going through that process.
Do we have any data on who is most likely to go through the process of freezing their eggs? If it's, early 20s, late 20s, early 30s, career-minded, things like that. Do we have a sense of the picture of how it operates in Canada?
That is a good question on if there's official data on who tends to go for egg freezing. I think anecdotally, at least when I asked, I think one of the doctors about it, he did say that it does tend to be people in their 30s, maybe late 20s, or potentially even in their late 30s, and that's just purely due to financial costs. Egg freezing is not for the light wallet. It can be definitely a bit of a financially intensive process. And, naturally not everyone in their early or mid 20s is going to be able to afford that, especially if you don't have the insurance, if you don't have the work benefits to kind of be able to supplement that support. So it does tend to be women in their early 30s or late 30s who might be a little bit more financially supported and more financially capable to take that on.
Okay. And, lastly, is it a case where someone who freezes their eggs is definitely going to use them to have a baby at some point or try and have a baby? Or is it more of a bit of peace of mind that if they feel they're at some point they may not be able to through natural means, that they have this other option available?
I think from my conversations, and even just from my own personal research, I think when people freeze their eggs, it's more of a peace of mind. It's more of if I decide to have kids, or if I wanted to have kids, I know that I have that option. I know that I can take that route if I would want to. That, if I'm at an age where I'm not able to naturally conceive, I'm not then filled with regret of, oh, I wish I was able to do this earlier. So I think it is more of that mental insurance. Is it a biological insurance? Not necessarily, in the sense that if you were to use your eggs to try and conceive children, it doesn't actually guarantee that you will have a child, because there's just so many other factors that go into that. But as you said, it does bring that peace of mind that if I were to choose to do this in the future, I could.
Well, Devika, it's a fascinating topic. Definitely shines a light on something that people are maybe less comfortable to talk about. And for those who are interested in reading more, they can check out your feature at nationalpost.com. Devika, thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Devika Desai. More from her at calgaryherald.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.